honor and privilege to introduce our guest speaker today. Richard Ginkowski was elected municipal judge for the village of Pleasant Prairie in 2013. Prior to that, he was a prosecutor for 3 decades, a graduate of Carthage College and the University of Wisconsin Law School. He is a member of the Judicial Division and Criminal Justice Section of the American Bar Association and vice chair of the editorial board of Criminal Justice magazine. Before law school, Judge Ginkowski graduated from the Davenport, Iowa Police Department Academy and worked as a police officer in Iowa and southwest Wisconsin. He is also a writer, photographer, and former journalist. Please join me in welcoming Judge Ginkowski.
Thank you, everyone, and I'd like to think sometime that we have this wonderful weather every year as a reminder of the sacrifice of the officers whose names are on the monument. And also like to recognize Chief Morrissey. As I told him, this is his last year as chief, according to his announcement at this ceremony. And I told him, you can't quit, slaves have to be sold. Thank you for this honor to be with you here today. And when I start court, every session, one thing I always tell people is the court belongs to the people, and I'm the one who is honored to have been elected to preside over it. And so today, the honored dignitaries here, every man and woman who wears or wore a badge, or swore to put his or her life on the line for a public that may or may not appreciate it. In fact, the greatest danger to law enforcement officers today doesn't necessarily come from a bullet, but from a public that doesn't understand, that doesn't get what real-world police work is like. And some officers, such as those we've honored today and in the past, have made the ultimate sacrifice. I come to you from an interesting perspective. I spent more than 3 decades working with officers, my privilege to do so as a prosecutor and now as a judge. Before that, though, I wore a badge and took the oath. I know what it's like to stop a car at night and wonder, is it a good citizen with a lead foot or someone who has just committed a crime that I don't know about and will stop at nothing to get away? I know how it feels inside when you find an open door at 3 o'clock in the morning and you're walking through the building, checking it out, and you hear a noise. And the relief it is when you realize that it's just the furnace that kicked in. I've been in situations where I was invited to engage in anatomical impossibilities by an adoring public, and in high-speed chases where I pray that the driver of the car coming up to the stop sign on the side road does indeed stop, because if he or she doesn't, I can't. And I know what it's like behind closed doors with many of our police officers. I know what it's like, for example, and remember when a 2-year-old baby, 2-year-old infant, was beaten to death. And it took 2 days to do the autopsy, because 1 day was spent just documenting the number of injuries on that child's body. You don't get to see that aspect of police work. I'm happy to report most of the time, most of our officers do a very good job, but they're human. They can and do make mistakes, and most of the time when something happens, it's a mistake. It's not some nefarious intent. And as a prosecutor, a judge, I know the hurt feelings, and sometimes worse when a case gets tossed out of court because things weren't done the right way. But that's not a result of evil intent. That's just human error. Misconduct? I've seen it. I've prosecuted it. I abhor it. And so does every honorable police officer, the vast majority who'd rather die than lie or tarnish their badge. The good news is it doesn't happen very often. And when it does happen, police officers are saddened and shocked and indignant because they too suffer as a result of the few bad apples. But today isn't about them. It's about good officers. It's about a society in which a growing number of people, misinformed, would not extend to a police officer seeking to protect them the same presumption of innocence we give to those who commit even the most heinous crimes. Well, thank God it wasn't like that in 1919. Unaware that 3 dangerous hoodlums had just blown open a safe at American Brass. They kidnapped the cab driver. Stopping at a service station for directions, the cab driver signals the officer that the thugs were armed, but it was too late. One shot and killed Officer Pingator. This community, the people of Kenosha, rallied and gave Officer Pingator's widow and their 8 children a home. Almost 8 years ago, May 16, 2007, 11:35 p.m. Deputy Sheriff Frank Fabiano was patrolling in Summers, and he stops an erratic driver. A University of Wisconsin Parkside officer, Jimmy Spino, pulled up to assist. Moments later, shots were fired. Frank Fabiano fell to the ground, and Officer Spino returned fire, but the gunman escaped, only to be captured by a consortium of officers who came together to bring this murderer to justice. This community came out in force to recognize Frank Fabiano's sacrifice on our behalf, an outpouring so moving that a Madison police officer who was at the funeral wrote the Kenosha News praising the people of Kenosha. Well, almost forgotten in all of this was Officer Spino, who witnessed this horrendous event live and lived to tell about it. He was able to testify at the trial. He easily could have had his name added to this monument in front of me. And so today I ask all of you to join me for a moment in recognizing Officer Spino's heroism in the face of deadly fire. And also thanks to Parkside's chancellor at the time, Jack Keating, the son of a Seattle police officer who ended several decades of misguided thought by several of his predecessors who thought that the campus would be safer if its police were unarmed. And then 4 years ago, this community turned out to honor a hometown hero, Officer Craig Burkholz of the Fond du Lac Police Department, who survived duty in Iraq and Afghanistan only to be fatally ambushed responding to a disturbance call at 6 o'clock on a Sunday morning. The reality, folks, is that every one of the officers you see here today could be the next Antonio Pingatore, Frank Fabiano, or Craig Burkholz. We've seen a chilling rise in the number of assaults on law enforcement officers just trying to do their jobs they swore to do and hopefully make it home safe to their families at the end of the day. But that's only part of the story. Think about Officer Pingatore or Deputy Fabiano for a moment. And then think about Officer Darren Wilson in Ferguson, Missouri. Yes, Ferguson. Officer Wilson, by all accounts, was a pretty good cop who saw two young men walking in the street who should have been on the sidewalk. So what did he do? He told them to get up on the sidewalk, and that was met with a less than pleasant response, laced with profanities. So Officer Wilson did the next best thing. He approached Michael Brown, who struck him and grabbed for the officer's gun. And during the struggle for control of it, shots rang out, and Michael Brown fled with Officer Wilson in pursuit. He commanded Brown to get on the ground, but instead the much larger Brown came at the officer, who fired the shots heard around the world. And we all know what happened after that. Without the benefit of a trial, without the benefit of an investigation, without the benefit of any clear thinking, thousands rushed to vilify Officer Wilson. Ferguson endured night after night of demonstrations and riots, and the rule of law evaporated as businesses were burned to the ground, and with them the livelihoods of the people who owned and worked in them. Officer Wilson was forced into hiding and then out of his job because it was no longer safe for him to be in the very community that he swore to protect and serve. Unlike even the most heinous criminals accused of a crime, Officer Wilson, for many, was presumed guilty by those who couldn't wait for the facts, unwittingly aided and abetted by a news media that so often lives by the motto, if it bleeds, it leads. And when the facts that came out during the grand jury didn't suit the fancy of those unwilling to hear anything else, the riots and protests continued, along with calls for a federal investigation, and that's what happened. There the angry crowds were, perhaps reminiscent of those demanding that Pontius Pilate turn over an innocent man, and this dragged out. Weeks and months went by. That federal investigation was concluded, and it blasted a series of questionable law enforcement and judicial practices. By the way, nothing that they couldn't have read in the St. Louis paper 2 weeks after the event. But guess what? It exonerated Officer Wilson. With all the pressure on the Justice Department to do something, do you honestly think for one moment that if they had a shred of evidence to use against him, they wouldn't have? But there wasn't. And not only did Ferguson and the good people of that city suffer, but so did Officer Wilson. Where does he go to get his civil rights restored? The months of anguish, threats, and injustice are shameful. This is not to defend bad police officers. When officers act outside the law, they deserve to be swiftly and promptly ferreted out and punished. Not only does the law and public confidence in our justice system demand this, but so does the good work of the honorable men and women who wear the badge. Do you think that any police officer starts his or her shift wishing that he or she could shoot somebody that day? That's insane. The harsh reality, folks, is that if the circumstances were somewhat reversed, Antonio Pingatore, Frank Fabiano, or any of the men and women in law enforcement today could easily become the next Officer Darren Wilson. And I say this not to rehash what happened in Ferguson, but to point out the fine line that officers walk every day, having to make decisions in split seconds that will be second-guessed for weeks, months, and years by people who've never pounded a beat, stopped a fleeing car, wrestled a drunk, or had to make real-world life and death decisions on the spot, aided and abetted by the self-aggrandizing charlatans who perhaps have motives other than truth and justice. So what do we do about this? I don't have all the answers, nor do we have a lot of time today, but good open communication and community relations is a start. There are no civilians in law enforcement. I hate it when I heard that word. It should be banned from the vocabulary. It's a team effort. It involves everyone. Chief Harold Breyer, tough as nails cop in Milwaukee, had a good saying: every officer is a community relations officer. We need to ramp up public awareness. It's not a one-sided conversation limited to the chiefs and a few talking heads. Chief Breyer had it right. Every officer is a community relations officer. It starts from the bottom up, not the top down. The reality is, officers need to tell their story. And if you don't, someone else is going to, and that someone else may not get it right. The public, the community that we serve, they are the stockholders and our partners. Never forget that. We are on the same mission. So there are no more civilians. We're all on the same side. 40 years ago, when I was in the police academy, yes, we had radios and computers back then. We had shoot, don't shoot training. Simulated situations where officers would have to make decisions whether or not to use fatal force. Some of those in a split second, a fraction of a second. And you know what? I've looked at dozens of videos and news stories where reporters have gone through shoot, don't shoot training, and universally they've come away shaking their heads because they either shot an innocent person or are blown away by an armed and dangerous one. Well, maybe we should invite every reporter and other people to see this training, to learn what it's like to have to make that type of decision. Maybe. When Frank Fabiano was murdered, Assistant District Attorney David Beyer and I had less than 48 hours to file charges against the accused killer. No, the investigation wasn't complete, but we had to have enough in hand to make a decision. On the flip side, when an officer is involved in the fatal use of force, why is it that he or she is left in a lurch of anxiety and suspicion for weeks and months? Well, only on television do they solve crimes in 60 minutes, less time for commercials, but the law mandating an independent investigation of these incidents is sound. But at the same time, adequate resources must be provided for the investigators to do so with both accuracy and promptness. The failure to do so is inexcusable. The public and the police both deserve justice, not delays, which often serve to inflame the fires of misunderstanding and prolong needless anxiety. Here, the Kenosha Police Association's billboard thanking the citizens of this community for their support was flamed by our local newspaper, which editorialized that it could be seen as trying to influence a pending investigation. Fair enough. But law enforcement officers who took an oath to protect the constitutional rights of others do not simultaneously forfeit their own. And where Where is the editorial taking to task the misinformed mobs, self-aggrandizing charlatans, and self-appointed legal scholars who never had a day in law school but suddenly are experts on the law of arrest, search, and seizure and the use of force? Why isn't their inflammatory rush to judgment being called to task? In closing, on this day, when we honor those who paid the ultimate price to protect this community, I'm reminded of a poster in an old Indiana police station of a dark and dangerous urban street. The poster read, "You wouldn't go down this street for $1 million. We do it every day for a lot less." To all of you who do that for us and who have done that for us, thank you. Thank you. May God bless you and keep you and your families safe.